Hey, Nick Owens here. Welcome to Hindsight History. I'm sitting down with the author of 4 New York Times bestsellers, most notable among them, Destiny of the Republic, River of the Gods, Hero of the Empire, and her first book, right here, The River of Doubt, Theodore Roosevelt's Darkest Journey, which has won several awards. It's a fascinating telling of the events that led to and followed Theodore Roosevelt's expedition of one of the most dangerous rivers on Earth. I'm very pleased to be joined here by Candice Millard. Candice, thank you for being here. It's so nice to have you.
Hi, Nick. Nice to meet you in person, and it's great to be on your show. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I mentioned this before the show. I meant it. Maybe the only author I can say this to. I've read all your books. I've read everything. And I'm sure we have many viewers who are familiar with your work. And I'm sure we also have some that aren't familiar. And I want to pause for just a second and say, do yourself a favor. Sometimes I think when people hear historical work, they freeze up. They think this is going to be dry. This is going to be homework. And what you figured out to do is write history in a way where you read it and it feels as though you're reading a gripping novel. All of it's true. You're a stickler for the facts. But your heart is in your mouth at times when you read these accounts you've written about.
Thank you.
Love the characters, the subject. I also love the time period you seem to be fixated with, which is also the time period I have long been fixated on. Let's start there. Mostly throughout your books, we're talking about when?
So they're mostly Victorian, Edwardian era. And I'd like to say that that was all intentional. My writing career as a book author started with River of Doubt. It was just this incredible story. And I was like, I can't believe this isn't already a book. I'm definitely going to try to tell this story. But what I found was, and what I think would be obvious to most readers and writers, is that it's just a really, really rich era, right? And it's easy to be really evocative and bring in all those details so you feel like you were there, you can smell it, you can see it. But also you have a lot to work with. So with narrative nonfiction, which is what I do, storytelling, but as you say, everything's absolutely true. So you have to have a lot of primary sources to work with. And at that time, everybody wrote letters and most people kept a diary, and the newspapers were, there was a morning newspaper and a night newspaper, and they told these incredible stories. They were really, really rich stories. In fact, I'm working on a book set in World War I right now. And I was just looking at this book that was written soon after in the early 30s. And I was like, this is narrative nonfiction, it's all true, but it's like, you're there, all these details. And so I just have a lot to work with. And that's such a gift for a writer.
Love that era. I think, too, the advent of the typewriter is just so fascinating. Everyone typed their correspondence.
Right.
I have used a few vintage Royal Underwood typewriters.
Right.
The sound, the texture of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I almost find myself writing as though I'm in 1910. A lot of "El fellow well met" language.
Exactly.
But absolutely love that. I think, too, with Roosevelt, he was so adamant at a very early age of even writing down specific diary entries, seemed very aware of his time that he was going to be researched heavily and going to make an impact.
Right. Yeah, he had definitely an eye on his legacy, an eye on history throughout his life. And I was thinking when you were talking about typewriters and how cool they are, a lot of people still handwrote too. And so I'm always like really, really thankful when they chose to use a typewriter because the handwriting can be completely indecipherable. For instance, Roosevelt's wife, she was an amazing person, but I cursed her every time. It was so impossible to read her handwriting. And also at that time, paper was in short supply, right? And it was a precious commodity. And so people would write, and then they would write around the edges. And sometimes even in the early Victorian era, they would write over their writing. So they would write just straight down, and then they would write slanted over it. And it's just a nightmare. But really, it looks really, really cool, but it's really hard to then translate that. So yeah, but Roosevelt was, as you say, he had always an eye on history. He wrote a lot of letters. And I always think about how he packed so much, and he was only 60 years old, right? So that would have been me dying in 4 years. I hope that doesn't happen. But I haven't accomplished like, a tenth of what he accomplished in just 60 years of his life. But at the same time, so while he's president, he's winning the Nobel Prize for Peace, he's exploring unknown rivers, he's going to Africa, he's doing all these things. He's also an incredible father, a really devoted and involved father. And there are all these letters that he wrote to his children with specific things about, I noticed your grades falling a little bit in history, work on that. I saw your football game, I mean, he's really involved and he could draw, he would make little illustrations in it. They really, really give you a sense of who he was. And again, that's such a gift for somebody who's writing history because not everything makes it into the book, but everything informs your understanding of the story and what happened during that time. Since you have to not only put yourself back in time, but put yourself into their lives. And anything that can help you better understand them, that's going to translate into the reader's experience as well.
Absolutely. I'm not sure if you visited Sagamore Hill, Oyster Bay.
Yeah, I've been there, sure. Yeah.
And I think I love this era of home.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
idea of the pneumatic tube. And you really feel like he's there to go and visit.
Absolutely. But I mean, who was it? John Burroughs, who said when Roosevelt walked into a room, it's like a stiff gust of air blew the door open, right? And that's who he was. And he's just one of those incredible, larger than life, once in a generation figures that continues throughout history. I mean, this many years after his death, more than 100 years, you can still feel him, right? You still get a sense of him by reading something he wrote or going to where he lived or going to where, some this expedition played out. I mean, you really, really get a sense for who he was.
Okay, which brings us to the River of Doubt. And I want to go back to your first words that you wrote in 2005, where you started with a prologue. I don't believe he can live through the night, George Cherry wrote in his diary in the spring of 1914. A tough and highly respected naturalist who had spent 25 years exploring the Amazon, Cherry too often had watched helplessly as his companions succumbed to the lethal dangers of the jungle. Deep in the Brazilian rainforest, he recognized the approach of death when he saw it, and it now hung unmistakably over Theodore Roosevelt. Do you remember what mood you were in when you had to write those first words?
I do, especially because it was my first book. So it was definitely a mixture of feeling. One feeling was fear for myself because I didn't know if I could write a book, right? And so these are, to get to the point where I'm writing, obviously a lot had happened before, but still writing is completely different from researching it, from organizing everything. And so there is a sense of fear, but also there's just this. What's most overwhelming is just this unbelievable fascination and this sort of incredulity that this happened to Theodore Roosevelt. This is Theodore Roosevelt we're talking about, not just, I mean, it'd be fascinating if it happened to anybody, if anybody had been in this situation. But the fact that it was Theodore Roosevelt is just incredible. And just this sort of gratitude that I have this story to tell, this incredible story, and it's so rich. And this is to me, when you start a book, if you read a book, you think, okay, that's of course the way you would start the story. But really, the writer can start anywhere, right? But to me, this was just the most obvious because it forces you to ask so many questions, right? Where is he? Why is he here? Why is he sick? Is he dying? What's going on? How did Theodore Roosevelt get in this situation? And so to me, you're just trying to grab the reader by the collar and pull them in. And not my writing, but the true situation to me did that.
Really feel as though you're there, and that poem he's reciting when he's laying on his back, it takes you in immediately. And I know I was hooked. We
Great.
talked about this a little bit before, but your sense of place. When you were writing this, you decided, I need to physically go to the remote rainforest and actually see what it was like to be there. And I think that's just the amount of investigative work that you did. Talk to me a little bit about just the incredible hurdles to reach this river today.
Well, first of all, I'll say, I worked at National Geographic, and I always say that that was really my real education as a writer and as a researcher. And part of what they do is they go to where the story played out. You always go. You don't try to just tell it, from your office in Washington, D.C., or wherever you might be. And that's a real privilege. And it's really the best part of the job is being able to go to these places. This was particularly difficult because, as you say, a lot of times people say, "Oh, I've been to the Amazon," but they've been on a cruise and they've gone to Manaus or something like that. That's not this. This is very, very difficult to reach. So what I had to do is I flew to this little town called Porto Velho. I hired a pilot. I rented a plane. And I flew over completely unbroken jungle from horizon to horizon for several hours to reach this river, and most of it is in protected Cinta Larga territory. And in theory, you can get their approval to reach it, but it's almost impossible. And I tried, and I talked to the New York Times reporter who had been in Brazil for years, and he was like, "It's never going to happen. You just can't even reach the people you need to talk to about it." But I found in just general government territory, there's this little fishing village, and this guy, he said it was like being on Gilligan's Island because he literally brought in a hammer and some nails and everything else he just took from the rainforest. And you just built these kind of simple little cabins there. And that was kind of my home base on the river. But it was really just extraordinary to be there because, first of all, you realize right away how dangerous this river is. I mean, I flew over the entire river. I could see all of it. I had the coordinates, so I could see where everything happened. But you see right away, you have these class 4, class 5 rapids right at the beginning. And then even being on the banks of the river, the waves are it's like an ocean because they're crashing against the banks of the river. And you got like we had piranha soup. You can't eat piranha fillet because there are too many bones in it. But they showed me they're fishing for our soup that we're having that night. The piranhas are this big. They're giant. I mean, this isn't like anywhere. This isn't like anywhere you have ever been. But it answered so many questions for me. For instance, one of the main questions I had when I started was, how is it that Theodore Roosevelt, this known, very experienced hunter, Cândido Rondon, who knows the Amazon better than anyone who doesn't live in it day to day, and their men are starving to death in the richest ecosystem on Earth? How is that possible? But you go there and you understand right away because the rainforest is completely silent and you really don't see anything that you could eat. You don't see. There are a few like monkeys way up in the canopy. There's no way you're going to get them. There are a few caiman sort of disappearing in the river. Now, things that will eat you and insects everywhere. You're just being eaten alive. But anything you can eat, good luck finding it. And it's just evolution, right? Everything's really good at either being a predator or not being prey. And both of those things mean that you have to be invisible. And that's the case. So it answered all of these questions for me simply going there. That would have been really difficult to truly understand if I were thousands of miles away.
And you had a pretty dangerous flight.
It did. So, like I said, I had hired this pilot and rented this plane. It was just a single engine plane. It was just a little plane. And I had also a fixer. He was my translator. He's a guy who's Brazilian and he's a journalist and he spent a lot of time in the Amazon. He was a really great guy, but he was hypochondriac. And so when we were at this little village, he decided that he was having a heart attack, even though, like we took his blood, we were like, "You seem fine." He's like, "No, I have to go." So he took the plane, he took it back to Porto Velho. And I was sort of like, I hope he comes back. Well, he did come back, but he had a different pilot then. And it was a younger, much less experienced guy. So one of the days we stop in this rubber tapping village and we're there for most of the day and we come back. And again, this is the rainforest, right? And so and we went during the rainy season because that's when Roosevelt and his men were there. And so you can imagine there's just so much moisture. And even when it's not raining, the air is full of moisture. But this guy, again, he's not very experienced and he didn't sump the tank. So he didn't let out the extra moisture out of the tank. So we get in and we're flying and we're about 1,500 feet above the rainforest. And, if you've been in a little plane before and this isn't like a, net jets. I mean, this is a little rickety plane and it's loud, And so we're flying and all of a sudden it just is silent. And the water had gotten into the engine and the engine had stopped. And this was a single engine plane. And we just started to drop like a stone. And my husband was with me, and I had thought that that was a good idea because he had been a foreign correspondent. He was a war journalist. He was extremely resourceful. But our oldest daughter was 8 months old at that time. She was here in Kansas City with my parents, and I thought, I'm an idiot. I've just orphaned our child. But I also thought, if we do crash, I hope we're killed immediately because no one would have ever found us. But by this unbelievable stroke of luck, this guy was literally just like clawing at the controls and he was able to restart the engine as we're flying, which is really hard to do. And we were fine, but it was really frustrating actually to me because he was really scared then and he just kept wanting to land where I had spent all this time and money getting there. And I was like, we've got to keep going. But, and unfortunately, just a few months after that, there were two freelance photographers in National Geographic who were killed in a plane crash over the Rio Negro. So these things do happen. We were really, really lucky. But I was able to continue and get the rest of the story.
Just reaching that point. So glad.
Restarted somehow.
As I read more about Theodore Roosevelt, I get the sense of a man in a hurry, his physical need to exert himself. Psychologically, I imagine that came from a lot of his weakness as a child. And it seems to me that he understood by the nature of his character that I'm a man of action,
Right.
I'm a man of courage. He understood and he saw the power of that as an attractive aspect of his personality, an essential ingredient of leadership. But what's most surprising to me is the courage and bravery part didn't come easily to him. He said very frankly in his autobiography, I was not born courageous. I did not inherit this. I was simply having to practice bravery.
Right.
How does one practice bravery today?
I think you have to be brave. I think you have to put yourself in situations that scare you. That's what they always say. Courage is not doing dangerous things. Courage is doing things that to you are scary, right? And so that's what he did. And it wasn't just I want to be brave, but like you said, I'm a man of action. And it also, in many ways, was sort of his saving grace. That's how he saved himself. So it was a pattern that started really early in his life. When his father died, when he was still in college, and he was really close to his father, and he really admired his father. And his father was really the first person who was like, you have the mind, you have to make your body, right? And so he wanted to be like his father, and he wanted to make himself for his father. And then when his father died, really just the floor fell out underneath him. And so he went to Maine, to the backwoods of Maine, and he pushed himself so hard that his guide said, watch out for Roosevelt. He'll kill himself before he'll even admit that he's tired. And then a few years later, when he was a young man and his wife and his mother died in the same house on the same night. And, there's the famous diary entry. It was just a big X, right? The light has gone out of my life, which you can imagine. And so that's when he went to the Dakota Badlands and he chased after cattle thieves, and he just put himself in difficult, dangerous situations again and again and again, became that crazy cowboy, But he challenged himself. sort of physically and emotionally, and he hardened himself that way. And that's what he did every time he would come across loss or sorrow or failure, things that he really had a hard time grappling with mentally. He would put himself in these really difficult, dangerous, the more dangerous, the better situations to test himself. And again and again and again, by being brave, he became brave.
Reminds me a lot of the way we train Navy SEALs and people like that today, throwing them into adverse elements,
Right,
saying
exactly.
this is going to prepare you for a real challenge and
Right.
extend your capabilities.
Right,
Roosevelt's always extending his
right,
capabilities in all
right.
these, you could call them storms that he's undergone. I am fascinated by this aspect of human beings.
Yeah.
George Patton seems like a good example. Those who imagine they are and become so. I put Roosevelt in that same vein.
I do too. And what you said about leadership, I think it is an essential part of leadership. And what I've noticed, and I also wrote a book about Winston Churchill, is that someone like Roosevelt and Churchill, it's not just that they themselves are courageous and strong, but that it's contagious, right? They make you and they believe in you. You can do this. And because they believe in you, you believe in yourself, right? And so it's this kind of contagious courage that they have. And that to me is the sign of a real leader.
Authentic leadership.
Right.
Now, here's the biggest question. You can imagine today if you were to board a boat and the crew hands you a pamphlet and they say, just so you know, the destination that you're headed to, we have flesh-eating piranhas, poisonous snakes, kangaroo fish, which can crawl up human
Any
orifice,
orifice, right?
deadly whirlpools, swarming insects at all hours of the day. And oh yeah, an indigenous tribe of Indians who have been said to practice cannibalism. So you go at your own risk. Most people get off the boat. Why did Roosevelt and these men go on such a dangerous expedition?
Well, I think the men did it because he did it. Again, it's this contagious courage, this natural, innate leadership. And I think he did it because he's Theodore Roosevelt and he's never going to say no, right? And he also, I mean, you have to think of him as a whole, all the things that he was. And one of the central things that he was a naturalist. He was an extraordinary naturalist from his youngest days, right? He was fascinated by mammals and birds and insects, and he would keep collections, in his room, and the family housekeeper hated it, and he donated his collection. His father was one of the founders of the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and part of his collection went there. And so he and even John Burroughs, this incredible naturalist. I mean, at one point they went on a sightseeing, a birding expedition, and Roosevelt knew more than Burroughs. And Burroughs was like, "That's impossible. That's crazy." So he was this incredible naturalist. So it was a perfect fit for him to go into the Amazon. And he also was proving something to himself. He had just lost the election of 1912. He wasn't used to losing. He had put a Democrat in the White House for the first time in 16 years. He had divided the Republican Party. He was a piranha for the first time, not a piranha, pariah. I said he was a pariah, not a piranha. He's going to go eat those. So he was proving something to everybody else, but mostly he was proving it to himself, right? He said, "This is my last chance to be a boy," but really, he was being sort of the fullest idea of himself as a man, really. He was just this incredible challenge, and there's no way he was going to turn away from this opportunity.
Right. Speaking of his fascination with mammals, you tell a fascinating story in the book of as a child, he discovers this seal
Seal.
on the
Right, right. So he's just walking down Broadway, and there's a seal, which was very rare for the area at the time, and he's just captivated by it, right? And so he goes back every day, and he takes notes on it, and he has a little pocket ruler, and he measures it, and he does sketches. And he said that seal filled him with every sense of romance and adventure. And it was just, yeah, that sort of encapsulates who he was as a child, but also who he was throughout his life. He was fascinated by nature and by science. And this was an opportunity to do something of significance for science, something real. I mean, this was a river. They knew the headwaters. They had no idea where it went. And he had the opportunity to put this river on the map of the Western Hemisphere.
It's stunning to me that they went on this expedition, they got on that boat. And Theodore Roosevelt, you mentioned in the book, was very content to leave his bones in South America.
Right, exactly.
It's
Right.
hard to imagine a lot of folks doing something like that today.
Right.
You know, we're in a different era. And as you described, actually visiting, you know, very dangerous.
It's still dangerous today, but it's much, much easier, much less dangerous today. Like when I went, I had GPS, I had a satellite phone, I had a modern boat. They were going down this and hauled out tree trunks down these incredible rapids and things. So it was just exponentially more dangerous at that time than it is today. And today, it's still dangerous.
Let's get inside the mind, if we can, of the Brazilian commander, Colonel Rondon, who's a fascinating character.
Absolutely.
He's responsible for the Strategic Telegraph Line Commission and literally is a pathfinder who has charted, and discovered thousands of miles of the Amazon. He's on the far end of his telegraph line when he gets a telegram asking him and ordering him to escort former U.S. president. And they eventually decide to go in an uncharted route, which had a pretty deadly past of really wreaking havoc upon anybody who entered there. He knew what he was getting himself into. Did he have a conscience about going on this expedition?
I mean, I think he had hesitation about going with Roosevelt. Not, I don't think, so much because, a former president of the United States might die on this trip. He was used to that. He was used to risking his own life all the time. He was used to risking the lives of his men. But he thought that, and rightly so, that Roosevelt might just want to kind of push through and I'm going to, put this notch on my belt. I've gone down this unmapped river. But Rondon was a scientist, right? And he cared deeply, deeply about not just stringing this telegraph line, but trying to map the Amazon. And so he wanted to do it correctly, and he wanted to take his time and have all the coordinates. So that's what concerned him. But Rondon was just this extraordinary person. As he was stringing the telegraph line, most of the men who worked for him had been taken directly from prison because most people would not work for him because it was just so dangerous. And he was kind of crazy about it because he would take these men and he would tell them, even if you're directly attacked, because they would go through the territory of a lot of indigenous tribes that had no contact with the outside world and were very warlike between themselves. He said, even if you're directly attacked, you cannot fight back. He said, die if you must, but kill never. And his men were killed all the time. And it's extraordinary. I mean, he was many, many times came close to death himself. And he was very kind. He was very compassionate, but he was completely unbending. But I will say he didn't ask anything of his men that he didn't demand of himself. If they were walking, he was walking. If they were risking their life, he was risking his life as well. And so to him, this was another leg of this long journey that he had been making. And of course, he might not survive it. Roosevelt might not survive it. They might all disappear and never been heard from again. That's just the job. But don't try to push me because I'm going to do it correctly.
And it's fascinating how devoted he was, as you mentioned, to Indian rights. He even loses one of his dogs.
Right. And he was very, very close to his dogs because, as anybody knows, he's in a position of leadership where you're the only leader and everybody else sort of looks to you for guidance and for help and for orders. You're alone. It's a very, very lonely situation. He was always away from his family for years at a time. And so his dogs were always his companions. So it would be almost like losing a child, to him. It was really, but again, that was part of the job.
What's fascinating to me and what you do in this book that I just absolutely loved, and this is the case in I think a lot of thrillers and tragedies, is how many small things had to happen to culminate into this extreme hardship. Small things. The priest, Father Zom, not experienced in expeditions. He's clearly over his skis. Being the one to plan the actual logistics, he orders these enormous boats that turns out they can't even take on.
All right. All right.
He then recruits a department store clerk, Fiala, to be quartermaster.
Right. A failed Arctic explorer in the Amazon. Right.
Arguably one of the least qualified to do this. He ends up packing olive oil, mustard, other things they don't really need.
Right.
And there's a scene in the book where the men are in the Brazilian highlands en route to the river, and their pack animals carrying all these provisions are starting to strain. They begin to buck off all of the provisions, and one by one, the men see these crates now in the mud. They can't pick them up and take them with them. And Roosevelt sees this happening, spent months packing these provisions, and he realizes in order for them to survive, the critical aspect is time.
Right. That's right. Yeah, I think to me as a writer and as a reader, the only way you're going to understand what these men endured and what they were experiencing is if you feel it the way they felt it, which is sort of in increments, right? And things start to worry you, right? Or things start to go wrong. And it is a big thing, obviously, if somebody dies or you're attacked or something, but it's also the small things that, anybody who's been in any difficult situations, there are little things you're like, oh, they packed a whole bunch of chutney. That's not good, right? We got into this river. We don't have boats that are going to work. We're going to have to buy these hauled out tree trunks. That's not good. And so little things that just start to worry you, right? And you're like, maybe we can fix it. Oh, wait a minute, we can't find anything to eat, right? We had to dump all of those provisions so we couldn't carry them, and we thought we could hunt, but we're not finding. And so it starts to snowball, right? And you're like, my husband and I always laugh about. There's this old Jim Carrey movie where he's being shot by all these arrows, these darts, right? And he's running, right? And it's more and more, and he finally collapses. He says, "Too many darts." And that's what it's like. It's like too many things. Like you think, I can probably fix that. I can probably fix that. I don't think I can fix all of these things. And as a reader, you're like, I think Theodore Roosevelt made it out alive. I don't know how though, right? Didn't he? He did live, right? Didn't he come? But that's what you want from the reader, them start to question, because the one of the challenges with writing history, especially somebody like Theodore Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, people like, I know he survived. I know Winston Churchill survived this, and he went on, World War II and everything. But it's like, but how? I'm feeling like, did he? That's what you really want, and it's the accumulation, like you said, that's very perceptive, because it's these little things that you start to worry about, and that, as a writer, you hope keeps the reader turning the page. But it's also, I think, giving them a more authentic experience, because that's what it was like for these men. This growing fear, this growing sense of doom.
Goes on, you really feel that. And I myself was just overwhelmed at how they even survived.
Great. Thank you.
So there's some great historical characters in River of Doubt that all play different parts. One of them is Kermit Roosevelt. Kermit is Theodore Roosevelt's third child. He's 23 years old, I believe.
23, 24, yeah.
And I believe, similar to his father, he'd become a bit of a Renaissance man.
Right.
He decides to accompany his father on this expedition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kermit was really an extraordinary young man. So he already speaks half a dozen languages at this point. He went through Harvard in, I think, 2.5 years. And he's already been in Brazil. By the time his father gets there, he's been in Brazil for a year, building bridges and really earning the respect of the people around him. You think, oh, this would be a child of privilege, and in many ways he was, but he was like his father. He was very serious. He was sort of poetic in a lot of ways. He was very literary, but he was also an incredibly hard worker. He just tried hard. And he didn't really want to go on this trip. He had just gotten engaged, this beautiful young woman, but he was worried about his father, and rightly so. And so he decides to take this time and travel with his father. And in many ways, it's really Kermit who is the hero of this expedition. When they're losing all of their boats, he's the first guy into the river to try to save them. When they get to a point where they think the rapids are just too strong, we're going to have to strike out into the rainforest, basically every man for himself. And he said, no, I can find a way to get us through. People believed him and they followed him because they had seen him, right, make good decisions, and they had seen him try hard. And so they trusted him. Unfortunately, his story is really the most tragic one of this book. Yeah.
He's in Brazil. He's striking it out on his own at the
Mhm.
Brazil Railway Company.
Mhm.
I loved this anecdote that you wrote about Theodore Roosevelt becomes so worried that his son Kermit doesn't have enough food at the end of every month
Right.
that actually begins sending him checks for food. And Kermit proudly, I think, might have been right around the equivalent of $6,000 in quarterly
Right.
installments. Kermit proudly tears them up as he wanted to really prove to himself
Right.
that he could strike out on his own.
Right, right. It's just like Theodore was with his father. Kermit's very much like that with his own. And, a few years later when Theodore dies, Kermit has unfortunately the same experience where he just feels like he has lost everything.
When I was a kid, one of my favorite films was Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Hmm.
And in the beginning of that movie, it opens with Indiana Jones in the South American rainforest trying to retrieve a golden idol.
Right.
And he's pursued by indigenous tribesmen,
Hmm.
poisonous arrows. As I read The River of Doubt, my mind instantly goes there. As on the Roosevelt Rondon expedition, they're not alone when they're out
That's right.
there. And
That's right.
they come across two nomadic tribes.
Hmm.
Whose territory did they encounter?
So first, before they get onto the river, they're in the Nambiquara territory, but they were known. They were known at least to Rondon. Once they get onto the River of Doubt, they don't know. This tribe and nobody knew. And in fact, when I started working on this book, still no one knew. And people had obviously written many biographies of Theodore Roosevelt. If you read those biographies, the ones that came out before my book, they just say, oh, they were attacked by these indigenous tribesmen. So that was another question that I had. Who were these people? And why didn't they just massacre them all? They certainly had every opportunity and really every reason, right? They could have been a danger to them. And also they were carrying these incredibly valuable supplies. And so what I did is I went to the American Museum of Natural History. And at that time, there was only one guy who was their anthropologist for all of South America. It was this guy named Robert Carneiro, this incredible guy. And I'll never forget, I went to his office. It was like in the bowels of the museum. It was a really narrow room, but super high ceilings. And it was just piled floor to ceiling with books and papers and file cabinets. And I sat down with him and I said, I'm trying to figure out what territory, who were these people, right? And so he said, and he disappears behind some piles of books. And I literally see papers flying. And he comes back and he sets this really old map out in front of me. And he looks at it and I realize it's sort of this map of where the different tribes are in the Amazon. And he points to me and he goes, it's got to be the Cinta Larga. And so I went to South America. I went to Brazil and I went to Sao Paulo. And I met with this guy named Sidney Passuelo, who was at that time sort of the modern day Rondon. And his job was to go into the Amazon and find these tribes. There's still groups that have not, they're literally shooting arrows at airplanes, right? They've had no contact with the outside world. Find where they are and not make contact with them because they realize is the best way to protect them is to not make contact, just know where they are so we can, leave them alone. And I told him Robert Carneiro's theory, and he said, absolutely, it's got to be the Cinta Larga. So then when I was in the Amazon, I went to this little town, Cacoal, which has a medical outpost. The Indian Protection Agency had a medical outpost there. And some of the Cinta Larga would go to that. And I met with several of the Cinta Larga. The Cinta Larga means wide belt. in Portuguese, and it's in reference to these broad strips of bark that they wrap around their abdomens to protect themselves during war. And it was fascinating. So I spent an entire day. They speak Tupi-Monde. But a couple of members of the tribe had been orphaned and raised by Brazilians, so they spoke both Tupi-Monde and Portuguese. So my translator spoke Portuguese and English, and so we went from Tupi-Monde to Portuguese to English and then back again. But I was able to ask them all of these questions, and the main one being, and also I will say they remembered this. This trip has become part of their tribal history, right? Because it would be like somebody coming from another planet. I mean, you would remember that. You'd tell your children, they would tell their children. And for the Cinta Larga, they had never seen white men. And so these men were pale and they were hairy and they were riding in boats, and the Cinta Larga had not yet developed boats. But they were incredibly sophisticated when it came to surviving in the rainforest, right? They could make their way through it, make trails using very subtly marked, like a twig broken here or something. They could follow these trails that there's no way Roosevelt and his men could. They could find things to eat, that the Roosevelt men couldn't even see or hear. They could kill it using weapons that were, much more sophisticated in many ways and effective than what Roosevelt and his men had brought. So anyway, so I asked them, why didn't they just kill them all? Why did Theodore Roosevelt survive this? And what they explained was that in the Cinta Larga tribe, there is no one chief. It's essentially every man is the chief of his family. And so when you want to make a big decision, when you're going to move the village, when you're going to go to war, you have to have a consensus. And they didn't have a consensus here. Some of them wanted to attack for the reasons I talked about earlier, but some of them were afraid. Understandably, it was a risk, right? And so because they didn't have a consensus, Theodore Roosevelt survived. And it's insane to think about. If that had not been the case, we would have never known what happened to Theodore Roosevelt. He would have gone down this unmapped river and never come out the other end. And nobody would have ever known. It would have been this, you can talk about what happened to JFK still being this you imagine that mystery. What happened to Theodore Roosevelt? He went into the Amazon rainforest and he never came out. And it's just mind-blowing. But again, it's going there. Sometimes it's the only way you can answer these big questions.
It was an area that Rondon, I don't even think, had familiarity.
No, he didn't know what group this was. They had had no contact with the outside world, and would not until I think it was the late 60s or early 70s. And as you said, they were known cannibals. And so also, when you think about Theodore Roosevelt would have disappeared, died, he probably would have been eaten, because they wouldn't eat another Cinta Larga, but when they would go to war, they would absolutely eat someone from another group. And Theodore Roosevelt wouldn't even look human to them. Certainly would have eaten him.
Now, there's a perception that I have of Theodore Roosevelt before I read your book. Early on, when he's president, and even during his time in the New York State Assembly, he's a trust buster. He's reining in business. He doesn't compromise very much.
Right.
And on the River of Doubt, it seems as though this might be the first time he clearly sees the environment that he's in,
Mm-hmm.
and obviously uncharted territory. At the same time, Rondon is painstakingly measuring every square inch,
Right.
slowing them down considerably.
Right.
And what's surprising is Roosevelt has many opportunities to leave with Kermit. He decides to stay with Rondon.
Mm-hmm.
And you have this larger-than-life caricature that is able to collaborate with Rondon, another fascinating historical figure.
What's interesting to me, one of the many reasons I wanted to write this book, is because this is a Theodore Roosevelt not many people know or think about. So you think of the crazy cowboy, you think the guy who's always in everybody's face, right? And really, really pushing. And that was true. But you have to remember, he turned 55 on this trip. And so he's older, he's calmer, he's wiser, he's survived a lot of sorrow and loss and frustration. And that changes you. And what I saw from the very beginning, I mean, it was interesting because, he's also known as this big hunter, and he was. But on this trip, even before they got to the river, they were on another river getting there. And these men were just shooting birds for sport. And he was furious. It outraged them and he made them stop immediately. And he would only allow hunting for survival eating, right? And so, and that's not the picture that we have of Theodore Roosevelt. He was also, he was beloved by the camaradas, right? The porters and the paddlers, because he was this great storyteller. He would tell them stories early on. And then when they're starving to death and he's really, really ill, he would give them first, like his ration of chocolate, right? He would give them, but then his son Kermit and George Terry, the American naturalist, had to watch him like a hawk because he would give them his food. Because he was like, I can't work, they're working, they need this food more than I do. So he would give away all of his food to them. And then with Rondon, he had real respect for Rondon, and he insisted that they be treated as equals. At one point, they are sitting around. This is again right before they get actually onto the River of Doubt. They're like just sitting around having a meal, and there's only one chair, and they give it to Roosevelt, and he refuses it. He said, "I'll sit when Rondon sits." Right? If he doesn't have a chair, I'm not having a chair. And he felt that way all along. Now, there were definitely moments when he disagreed with Rondon, and he was frustrated with him because, as you say, Rondon, wants to carefully tread the river, and Roosevelt, it's not himself he's worried about. He's got his son with him,
Yeah.
right? My son's going to starve to death because you're insisting on taking this measurement and again and again and again to make it sure it's right. I don't care about that, but Rondon did. Rondon was used to risking everybody's life and his own for the bigger picture. And Roosevelt, again, had his son. And so there was disagreements, but he never just sort of, overrode him, which he definitely would have done before in the White House or whatever situation he was in.
Yes. There's a dramatic scene in the book where the men are having to build a new dugout, a new canoe. They've lost several already. One of Rondon's men, Paishon, discovers that a fellow camarada has been Julio stealing provisions and the limited store of rations. This very quickly escalates. What happens next?
Right. So Roosevelt is very, very sick by that time. And he and his son Kermit and George Terry are just sitting, resting when the camaradas are bringing in bags. And Paishon is enraged because this is not the first time that Julio has been caught stealing food. And again, they're starving and every little bit matters. But he doesn't have time really to do much about it. Like, we've got to keep moving to try to get out, right? And so he just berates him and he tells him, take your supplies that you're supposed to be carrying and move on. So Kermit and Roosevelt and Cherry see Julio come. He drops his load. He's mumbling, and they kind of joke about, like, we knew it was him coming because we could hear him groaning and complaining all along. So he drops his load and he picks up a rifle, and they think, oh, he must have seen something that he can shoot. That's good. Maybe hopefully it would be a monkey or something that we can eat for dinner. And he walks off, and soon after they hear the shotgun go off. They hear it fire, and they think, oh, he must have been successful in hunting. But then just seconds after, these camaradas come running, shouting that Julio has murdered Paishon. And Roosevelt, again, is so ill, but he is the first person, of course, he jumps up, he grabs a rifle, and he heads right to where this man was just murdered. And they're all trying to stop him, or at least try to keep up with him, and they get there and they find Paishon face down. He's been shot straight through the heart. And their first fear is that Julio will kill again, right? He's unhinged, and he's dangerous, and he's killed one man. Chances are he's going to kill another. But fortunately, pretty quickly, they find the rifle that he dropped when he fled into the rainforest. So the question is, and this again, where the difference between Roosevelt and Rondon. So Roosevelt says, this is frontier justice. We find him, we try him quickly, we kill him. He obviously killed a man, he needs eye for an eye, right? Rondon says, Absolutely not. This is a country. This is my country. We are a country of laws. We find him, we secure him, we feed him, and we take him with us till he can go and face justice, right? Go through a trial and go through the whole system. Roosevelt thinks that's insane. I mean, they're starving to death as it is, and they are running out of time, and they're going to have to watch this dangerous man. He's just going to sit there placidly. He's not going to try to kill again. He's not going to try to steal again. But what happens? They can't find him either way, so they decide to just move on, and they're going down the river, just trying to survive. And they hear a voice, and they turn and they see Julio from the banks of the river. And this is much later, and he's been through hell, and he's crazy, and he knows that if he goes with them, he'll probably be killed at some point. But he begs them to take him with them, and they don't, and they leave him to certain death in the rainforest.
This is one question I want to ask. It's an incredible hypothetical. If they take Julio back, he survives. Is he tried? Is he criminally prosecuted?
I think absolutely yes. I mean, again, this is Rondon, and he does things the correct way. And, again, this is a country of laws, and this is the law, and that's what we do. And he would do everything to make sure that Julio was brought to justice.
This is what stunned me. It's obvious that Theodore Roosevelt had a very high pain tolerance. He had been shot in the chest while giving a speech for the bull.
And continue to give a speech. Yeah.
And clearly could take a lot.
Right.
He strikes his right shin on the river of doubt and begins to get an infection. Not a great place, of course, for all the insects do such. And you begin to see the pathos and the decline of his energy and spirit. And it's the first time I can recall that you see him in a much weaker state.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it's fascinating, too, because this, again, tells you a lot about the man that Roosevelt was, because he had obviously been on a lot of dangerous trips in his life, and he always carried with him a lethal dose of morphine because he never wanted to endanger the lives of the other men he was traveling with, because he was too weak to continue, right? And so this happens again. So he, like you said, he hits his shin, he gets this horrible infection, he's really, really sick. And Kermit is terrified that he's gonna die, and everybody's watching him, and he can't even sit up. And again, they're in these hauled out tree trunks, and they're in these horrible rapids. They're starving, they're being attacked in every way conceivable. And Roosevelt is slowing them down, and he knows that. And so he calls his son, and he calls George Cherry, the naturalist, into his tent one night, and he says, "It's okay, you go on, I'm going to stay here." And he had decided to take this lethal dose of morphine. And it's really interesting because the only reason he doesn't, and again, the only reason Theodore Roosevelt's story didn't end right there in the Amazon rainforest, is because he realized that the best way to save his son was to let his son save him, because Kermit wasn't having it. He wasn't going to leave his father behind. And Roosevelt realized that he's going to work so hard to get me out alive that he'll also get himself out alive. And so that's why he decided he didn't take that lethal dose of morphine on the banks of the River of Doubt.
You read that exchange between Kermit and his father, and it's almost reads like a classic play. It hits you right in the gut.
Right.
That he was able to save his father and recognize that.
Right. That's right. I thought so.
So after 3 months on the River of Doubt, the men are able somehow to make it through. At this time, Roosevelt has lost 55 pounds, a quarter of his body weight, and his clothes are so thin they hang on and feel scary.
Right.
When he returns home, he is met not with applause, but with a lot of scrutiny and disbelief around the accuracy of the geographic data during this journey. I imagine many just do not believe the account.
Mm-hmm.
How does he respond to that skepticism from these geographers?
Yeah, so you have to imagine, well, you think, okay, this is a former president of the United States. He claims to have put on the map of the world this river that's almost 1,000 miles long. It's a principal tributary of the Madeira, which is a principal tributary of the Amazon River. This is a significant find. This is a significant addition to our geographical knowledge, which is the only reason Roosevelt would have done it, right? And so, yeah, so you have these famous, I mean, the president of the World Geographical Society, all these famous explorers just saying, yeah, right, there's no way. Yeah, that's, and so, but again, I mean, this is Theodore Roosevelt. So he says, you know, the great thing about a river is it's still there and you can go out and look for yourself. And also bring it on, put me in the biggest, most challenging environment you can. So let me speak of the National Geographic Society. Let me speak of the World Geographical Society. And he does. And he explains everything. And by the end, my favorite is when he goes to England, Royal Geographical Society. These people are not nice. They're really smart and they're really competitive and they're out for blood. And by the end, I mean, and it's totally packed, right? People are crying, like grown men are crying because they can't get in. People are pressed against the windows trying to get in. And by the end, I mean, everybody's laughing and they totally agree with him and they love it. He's just sort of won everybody over because it's, I'm sorry, it's just the truth. And he's like, the facts are the facts. And so after that, there are two expeditions that try to recreate it. Let's, take him up on his challenge. And they go. The first have to turn back. It's too dangerous. The second disappears, and we never hear from him again, which is absolutely what could have happened to Roosevelt and his men. And then finally, on the third time, they are able to retrace the whole thing, and they say that it was exactly as Roosevelt said it was.
One of the things too, just talking about this experience, anyone who's watching who thinks, what's the significance of it? I know Theodore Roosevelt was president at the start of the 20th century, goes on this expedition. What's the real significance there? One of the things that stands out in your book is, it's stunning to realize that he takes a boat and says farewell to the country, and he's absent from the continent for 6 months.
Right.
Different than you see today. There's no Air Force One, quick trip,
right.
Reykjavik, sign an accord, will be back for dinner.
Right.
He's literally absent. And tough to recall. I know Wilson traveled quite a bit as well, but just during that time, for current or former president, just
right.
completely removed from the country.
Right. I know. I always think, imagine like George W. doing this, or Trump, or Biden. They just, first of all, they wouldn't do anything that dangerous, and then secondly, if they tried to, you're right, everybody would know where they were every step. It's really, really dangerous, or nearly impossible for somebody to do something like this today. Again, with all the modern technology and things, to just be completely off the grid. And to me, one of the things that's most interesting about Theodore Roosevelt, I find it fascinating about him because, he used to say, if you don't have the great event, you don't have the great leader, right? If you don't have the war, you don't have the Great Depression, something like that. And he didn't. He didn't have those things in his time during his administrations. But yet, he's still one of the most beloved, one of the most famous, one of the most remembered presidents in our nation's history. So why is that? And it's got to be just the strength of his personality and what he represented, just him. It's not all these other events. It's him. Again, he was this extraordinary, rare human being that we still can learn from today. It's extremely rare. So if we're that fascinated by him and focused on him today, imagine how the country felt about him at that time. So even then, it was insane that Theodore Roosevelt was going to go and disappear, and nobody, and when they got to the river, some men were coming back and some were kind of shunted off to a different trip, and so they would get these stories back, and where's Theodore Roosevelt? What happened to him? Will we see him again? It's insane.
It's something you would almost read from an Ernest Shackleton.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
I believe it is the Rio Roosevelt.
Right. It is.
It's,
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
it's incredible.
Exactly.
I'm curious about another historical figure. His name has come up in the book, Woodrow Wilson.
Right.
He's president after Teddy Roosevelt, and they're both progressives. So they both stand for a lot of the same things. And in fact, Wilson gets a lot of things passed that Teddy Roosevelt would have loved to have gotten with.
Right. Right.
So you'd think they'd be on the same page. During World War I, Teddy Roosevelt very badly wants to go and fight.
Mm-hmm.
He's too old to fight.
Mm-hmm.
He goes to Wilson for a dispensation. Please let me go and fight.
Mm-hmm.
Wilson won't give it to him.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I look at that episode, I've read about Theodore Roosevelt, I've read about Wilson, and you look at it from both sides and you think probably some jealousy there.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, Teddy Roosevelt said some pretty nasty things about Wilson in his time, and so he was probably jealous too of Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
But this is an opportunity for Wilson, who's known to hold grudges, to let him go. But instead, he says, I'm not going to give you that. I'm not going to bring you into the limelight,
Right.
go and fight, potentially even die
Right.
over there. Why did these two men despise each other so much?
Or I'm not going to let you potentially go fight, become a hero again, and come back and try again, right? Because he could have run again for president. You know, it wasn't until after FDR was, president many times that we had a limit. And his second term hadn't been, or his first term hadn't been a full term, right? Because he had taken over from McKinley. So he certainly could have. I don't know Wilson well enough to know what he was thinking. I know that Roosevelt resented Wilson, again, because Wilson got his war, right? And if you think about it from Wilson's perspective, not only was Roosevelt too old, he was broken down. I mean, he used to say, happy to pay the piper for a good dance, right? And he had, right? I mean, he never recovered physically from the river of doubt. He never did. And at one point, they told him, you're going to have to live the rest of your life in a wheelchair. And he said, I can work that way too, right? He never stopped, but it did really break him down. So really, he really could not have gone to World War I. But for him, because his father didn't fight in the Civil War, right? Because his mother's brothers have been on the South and he didn't want to do that till she begged him not to. But it always bothered Roosevelt, this man he admired so much, had paid another man to fight for him. So he was always going to throw himself into every war to prove, right, his courage. And he expected his sons to do the same. What's most devastating is that it's his son that he loses, right? His son Quentin, his youngest beloved son, ends up dying. And I really think he's shot down over France. And I really think that that's really what finally broke Theodore Roosevelt, losing. He was supposed to die in a blaze of glory on the battlefield, not his child.
Right. It's almost so he died of a broken heart.
Yeah.
And when you get to that moment, I view Teddy Roosevelt wants to bring the Rough Riders back out again. Like up San Juan. Much different.
Right.
1914.
Right.
Or it was mechanized.
Right.
And I give Wilson the benefit of a doubt that here's this old soldier.
Right.
And what would that look like to, say, a General Pershing who's trying to gallop?
What am I supposed to do with this guy? Right.
You get Teddy Roosevelt in the paper every day doing these things. He's trying to capture the Kaiser on a donkey.
Right. Exactly. And I'll tell you, the book I'm working on now is set in World War I, and we were talking about, we're here in Kansas City. The World War I Museum is very near, and I've done a lot of research for that book and this. And I had this big binder. It's full of pictures and postcards and things from World War I. And I noticed one of the tabs, it's organized by tabs, and one of the tabs said Roosevelt. And I was curious, so I opened it. It's devastating. They have a picture that the Germans turned into a postcard of Quentin's body. So after he was shot down out of his plane, they pulled him out of his plane and they took a picture of his body next to his plane and made it into a postcard.
I've seen that photograph.
Have you?
And it's just haunting to,
oh my God,
as a parent,
yeah,
seeing your child.
Yeah.
And probably must have been a
nothing
very
worse.
sobering moment for Roosevelt, who had fought in the Spanish-American War, but just
Right.
seeing the result of really the turn of the 20th century and what war had become.
Right. That's right. No, it's, yeah, Winston Churchill said, with war, because he was fascinated with war as well, but he said, you cannot gild it. The horror comes through, and it does.
With
Yeah.
another hypothetical, if TR had been in the White House in 1914 when the war broke out, do you see that conflict could have been more swiftly resolved?
I mean, yes, hard to know. I do think that we would have entered the war much more quickly. Knowing Theodore Roosevelt, he absolutely would have been there. We wouldn't have been at hesitation. We would have gotten right in, which I think probably then in turn would have, I think, led to a swifter conclusion.
It's difficult to speculate, but
Hmm.
he would have been superbly equipped. He
Hmm.
knew a lot of
Hmm.
those emperors and
Hmm.
stayed in their palaces,
Hmm.
spoke their languages,
Right. That's right.
Russo, Japanese. Seems very clear by about 1915, a lot of the major powers wanted it to end. The
That's right.
Schlieffen plan is
Right.
awful. It's a mess. This trench warfare
Hard.
around.
Right.
It would have been interesting to see him in the White House during that time.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm curious, as I said at the beginning, I've read all your books. I love the subjects, and I love the way you write. And I'm curious what your process is.
So it takes me 5 to 6 years for most books, and 80 to 90% of that time is research. It's research and organizing. So I begin just by casting a very wide net and just getting all the information that I can, going to archives, going to where the story played out. And you always go into it sort of knowing some things that you have to get, right? But there are always things that surprise you along the way. So I always do all of my own research for that reason, but also just because I love it. It's my favorite part. So why would I give that to somebody else? But it does take a long time. And then you come back to your office and you're just drowning in these letters and diaries and newspaper articles and books. So I take about a year just to organize it, right? To go through. And I'm very old school. I just got Scrivener, this writing, but I'm just starting to use it. My kids just laugh at me. I'm like, I don't know. I just use Word, right? And I separate everything out. But so it just is a long, long process. But it's like I always tell my kids, there are no shortcuts if you want to do things right. So it takes me a long time to organize all this stuff. I read everything, I highlight things, I annotate things, I make notes, and then I transfer it over. But it's in the transfer process that you really start to understand, right? It really gets in your bones. But also, you see holes in your research and you go back and do more. And then I outline, and I spend at least a year working on the outline. And I'll talk to high school or college students, and they don't like to hear it, but I always say you have to outline if you want to do this kind of writing, especially. I think for fiction, you can maybe kind of find your way. Some fiction writers say it really would ruin it if they tried to outline, but I think especially for narrative nonfiction, um, again, like we were talking about, you first of all, you can start the story anyway. Really, there are a million to you have to kind of figure out, but you also have to have, if you want to have things like foreshadowing or tension or cliffhangers and things, you have to figure out how you're going to tell the story, and so you have to work on that ahead of time. And also, then when you start writing, you want to have the freedom to be able to really focus on the writing, to focus on things like word choice and pacing and rhythm, to you hope really make it sing. And it's hard to do that if you're like, oh wait, actually this doesn't belong here. I should move this around. And you can't get in deep because you need to see the bigger picture first, right? So you have to go out this wide first, and then you can go in deep. But you have to have that structure. And it's kind of a gift to yourself too, because a lot of times people say, don't you get writer's block? Isn't it horrible to just like face that empty page? And yeah, it is. But at least I've got my outline. I know I have the structure, right? I know I'm going to tell the story, and then I can tell the story.
Makes a lot of sense. And I think of Hemingway in A Movable Feast.
Yeah.
If he says, when I begin writing, sometimes I know how much I have in the tank. Stop when I have a little bit left because I don't want to stare at the blank page the next day.
Right.
And it seems like that really works in your case, outlining. And I've heard the worst thing a writer can do is binge writing, where you go 10 hours in one day because you probably won't be able to get back the next morning and write it.
Well, I don't think it's any good, too. I mean, you can force yourself, but you probably will hate what you've written, And so, a couple of things. One, another thing I do once I start writing is what usually happens. It takes, once you sit down, it takes you a while to kind of get back into the groove and everything. And then, with my kids are growing up now, but I would always be like, I'd have to stop at like 3 o'clock because I have to go get in the pickup line to pick them up from school. And so what I would do is I just like whatever is in my head, I would write it in all caps, something like this, and then the next day when I would come in and be like, oh, great, thank you, because that's that rope I needed to pull on, right? I'm not just diving into oblivion, I've got, oh, that's right, I remember, and I can pretty easily get back into where and then start going. And so, but also it gave me a framework. It was sort of forced discipline, right? So I couldn't start until like 9 o'clock after I dropped my kids off, and I had to end about 3 o'clock. I might, after I get into bed, might be able to steal a little bit of time, especially if I'm just reading or something, or I'm editing something. Writing is harder. But knowing that I had this window of time, and really only this window of time, it forces you to be more disciplined. If you have all day, it's really hard to, and especially, and I have an office outside of my home because, I think I should probably do that laundry. The kitchen is disgusting. I need to go pick it up, whatever. There are all these possible distractions. But in my office, I walk in, I close the door, and I go back in time. And that's all I do there. And it really helps.
It's fascinating how the human mind works in your case with the all caps,
Mm-hmm.
finishing a lot of those ideas.
Right.
Do you have a routine? Is there obviously maybe a green tea next to you or anything specific that you have to begin the process?
Yeah, I'm not too much like that. I mean, I do go through a lot of green tea during the day. I like to be comfortable, and I'm not, heels kind of girl anyway, just like comfortable clothes. And it's kind of nice to be able to do that. But I do like, I get up, I take a shower, I have breakfast, I go to work, and it's a job. It's my job, and I take it seriously like that. And that's really, I mean, I have a friend here who's a novelist. He's a really great guy and really great writer. But I remember we were being interviewed together one time, and they asked us, what we wrote on, and he literally said, and I'm sure it's absolutely true, that he writes on his blind great uncle's typewriter, vintage typewriter, right? And I'm like, yeah, I use a computer, I have my desktop or my laptop, and it's just so much easier. You can move things around, and so there's not a lot of romance. I don't light a candle or something. It's not a lot of romance. It's just kind of work, But I love it. The best part is I really enjoy it. I'm excited to get started every time.
Is there ever any bit of dread with the writing? Is there just a tinge of dread sometimes?
Well, sometimes. Yeah, exactly. It's going to be good, and afterward, good for you, and afterwards, you're glad that you did it. Yeah, sure. There's a little bit of that. I mean, there are always times when I'm struggling, and I'm like, "What am I trying to say?" Or I know what I'm trying to say, and it's just not coming out. It's just terrible. It's just ugly. But at this point in my life, since I'm working on my fifth book, a couple of books in, I realize like I know it's going to be hard, but I also know that I can do it. And that is, I used to be an editor, and I never really liked editing other people, but I love editing myself. It's really, so once it's written, as ugly as it might be, I know that I can get it to where at least I think it works. And I do enjoy that kind of wrestling with it. It's a lot of writing is kind of like, being a detective, doing the research, but also working a puzzle, right? When you're working with your outlines, moving things around, and oh, actually that fits here, and this is how I should end that chapter. And then the writing is, a lot of it is just wrestling with it. It's like, it's like as we were talking about earlier about like, if you wanted to be a singer, I could try and try and try and never be a good singer. I'm not saying I'm the world's greatest writer, but that's the one thing that I'm pretty confident. Like I I I have an ear for it, right? And I can hear when it's wrong. And sometimes it'll take me a while to figure out how to make it right. But I'm pretty confident that I can make it right. And it doesn't mean that I don't have the occasional dud, but usually I can hear it, and I'm confident that I can fix it.
I just want to briefly mention Destiny of the Republic. Absolutely love that book.
Thank you.
The era, of course, that I love. You have so many characters. One of our earliest assassins,
Right.
as
That's
well. And you'll correct me if I get this wrong, but my sense was we're a young, vibrant, optimistic nation,
right.
but there's evil.
Exactly. And it's kind of what we were talking about, these things that you can have foreshadowing and you can have tension in nonfiction. And in this case, that's why I decided. So there's this man named Charles Guiteau, and he's obsessed with Garfield, and he believes that he's mentally ill, he's delusional, and he believes that he made Garfield president, and that Garfield then therefore owes him a job. He should make him, the ambassador to France or something like that. It's something extreme, and he's done nothing in his life that would warrant that. But he starts following Garfield, and the prologue is with Guiteau on this steamship. There's a wreck, and many people died, and he is saved, and he believes that God saved him for a purpose, and he comes to believe that that purpose was to kill the president. And so what I'm setting up there, and I go back and forth between these two men, is that here's Garfield, this brilliant young man, decent, kind, brave, all the things that we would want in a leader, just going about his life. And here's evil personified coming behind him, right? And I want the reader to be like, if somebody stop him, look, stop him. Stop what's going to happen, and it's going to happen. But you can't. And so you're turning the page like, surely somebody's going to stop this guy. So it's the same thing, but that it takes working on the structure.
Yes, really changed my thinking on Garfield.
Mm,
I'm not sure where I put him on the list.
sure.
Lincoln's number one.
Sure. Same.
Obviously, Van Buren and Warren Harding. Your list may be different than that,
Okay.
but just kidding.
Yeah.
No, your book,
Like there must be things about them I don't know. So sure there are.
your books are so cinematic to me that some have been optioned for film. Is that something you would like to see, that these movies get portrayed on the big screen?
Sure. I mean, the thing is, I don't see myself doing the screenwriting. I love what I do, and I'm just going to sit here in Kansas and be a mom and be a writer of history and feel very, very lucky. But sure, I think, yeah, it'd be great. And we'll see. A couple of them have been optioned different times and in different ways. But I also think of my husband and I have a friend who's had a book that was optioned and made into a movie, and the movie was kind of a disaster. And people would say to him, "Oh my God, look what happened to your book. Are you so upset what happened to your book?" And he's like, "Nothing happened to my book. There's my book right there. It's the same. Nothing happened to my book." And so your book is your book, right? And it's whatever you tried to make it. And then whatever happens beyond that, you hope for the best, but it doesn't really affect you.
Seems at a certain
We've done-
point you have to let go of that control.
Right.
I
Right.
mean, your interest is a lot different than the folks that made the recent Jurassic World.
Right.
They're going to say,
Right.
"Can we put a dinosaur on the River of Doubt?" You're gonna say no.
Yeah. But they'll be, they take liberties and things, and I understand that. And to some extent, that's okay. I always think as long as they keep the character of the person.
It was interesting to see. It looks like DiCaprio and Martin
Oh, right,
Scorsese are
right,
in pre-production of a Roosevelt film.
right.
Be looking out for that in the years.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what they do.
So now the question is, what's next for you? You touched a little bit on book 5.
Right.
Mind sharing
Sure. So it's set in occupied Belgium and France during the early days of World War I. And it's about this, what becomes a network of people who start hiding Allied soldiers. It's a British nurse, a French school teacher, a French prince and princess, brother and sister, a Belgian architect, a priest, a miner. All these people start at first individually. They either these soldiers are left behind during war. They're injured or just in the chaos of battle. They're left behind, and they're going to be killed if they don't get out. And so they go looking for help. And so They help them, they get them food, they get them medical care, and they find them a guide to help them escape through the border with the Netherlands. And then slowly they find out about each other and they become this loose network helping each other and helping these men until they're all betrayed. They're betrayed by a Frenchman who pretends to be a wounded soldier. He targets the students of this nurse, the young students, and he's like, "Can you help me?" They take him to this nurse who hides him. He keeps making excuse after excuse why he can't go, and he figures out the entire network and betrays them all, and they're all rounded up and arrested.
It certainly covers that area, that era that you're passionate about.
Right.
One of the things, and does this take place beginning of World War I?
Yeah. It's the early days. Right, right, right. It's just as the Germans, they want to, you mentioned the Schifflin plan, that they want to get to Paris. And so they ask Belgium, can we just go through? We won't. And then Belgium was like, of course not. And so they go through and they just massacre everyone and burn everything down. It's at that time.
An interesting note, what most kids learn in school about World War I is there's this great world war. America's not in it. Major powers fighting one another. Germans torpedo the Lusitania. Lusitania sinks, and America is outraged by this. They enter the war. Not necessarily true. There is a time period of, I want to say, is it several months?
Yeah, it's quite a bit of time. Yeah, right. It definitely takes a while. And so, and all of this book takes place before and so the main American who's in it is this guy named Brand Whitlock, and he was American ambassador to Belgium at that time. And so he is the representative for any British citizen in Belgium. And he's trying to figure out what's going on and trying to help them. And the Germans are trying to just quickly execute as many as they can before people can stop them. So yeah, it's a really extraordinary story, and it's for the first time. I'm going to have three main characters, and they're all women. And I've obviously wanted to, as a woman, as a mother of daughters. I have three sisters. I have a very strong mother. I've wanted to tell a story of a woman, but it's really hard to do because although women have done extraordinary things throughout history, other people weren't writing about them. And so you need not just them to write about it, but other people. Like my book about Churchill, I mean, he was 24, 25 years old during that time, but other people are paying attention to him, right? And they're writing about it. So I had a lot to work with. In this case, it's exactly what you want too, because it was a huge deal at the time. But it's been largely forgotten. And one of the women of the three is executed. The other two survive. They're put in a hard labor in a German prison, and miraculously they survive it, and they wrote books. And these books are just extraordinary. And I'll tell you one other quick story. It's the kind of thing that you love as a writer. So the woman who's executed, her name was Edith Cavell. And she became very, very, very famous. And there are mountains named after her, schools, roads, things. A lot of Americans haven't heard of her, but many British people have. But she was this Red Cross nurse, and she ran this a clinic and a nursing school. And she had just a very small, very spare apartment in that school. And so after she's executed, her sister comes and takes her few belongings. And one of them was this a needlepoint cushion, a chair cushion. And she just took it for sentimental value. 30 years later, she gave that cushion to this woman who helped her clean her house. And this woman took it home, and the woman's husband was like, this cushion is kind of bulky. It feels kind of heavier than it should and kind of strangely shaped. He opened it, and he found pages from Edith Cavell's diary, because the Germans had been watching her very closely. They'd been making unannounced inspections, and she had burned most of her papers, but she had hidden these in this cushion, and they weren't found for 30 years. Yeah.
We're literally turning every page. That's going to really bring a lot of life into this story.
Yeah.
Interesting too in World War I, but human civilians were, decimated.
Oh my gosh, it's just wrenching. Yeah, the atrocities are just unbelievable. My husband's German on both sides, and he was like, "Oh no, those Germans." I mean, because we always think about World War II and the horrors there, but they were just as bad during World War I. They really, except for the Holocaust, obviously, but what they did to the Belgians, especially, and the French, is just unspeakable.
It's great that you have these written accounts from these women, as not everybody could be like Churchill. He
Right, right. Yeah, exactly.
was a great writer himself. What about opinion?
Exactly. Right, right. And bricklayer.
Well, this has been an absolute treat.
Thank you.
I do this show. It really delights me. And when someone such as yourself is willing to do it. And so I always thought, wouldn't it be great to sit down with Candice Millard? And it's been an absolute treat. So thank you very much.
My great pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
And we have a question from social media
Okay.
from Emily, who says, how do you suppose historians will decode the modern past, the information age where journals are rare, access is limited, and the delete button can change the truth?
I think it's extremely difficult, and I don't envy them. I think that's why I'm going to stick in my little Victorian Edwardian. And I also, people will say, oh, someone who's still living, this would make it great. And I just don't want to do that for many, many different reasons. And so I think it's a great question. I don't know how to answer it. I mean, I think, it's really hard to get depth of thought and feeling from a tweet or from a text even, and people just don't spend the time thinking about it like Roosevelt did in his letters or his diary entries, because you not having an eye on your legacy, on history when you're writing something quickly. You're not even worrying about spelling or any kind of punctuation or anything, like, much less really conveying sort of what's important to you, what you hope, will be continued in the future. So I think it's definitely going to be a challenge. I just hope that there are, people in positions of importance who will take that in consideration and spend time putting their thoughts to paper.
Right? It's fascinating. The National Archives is now archiving tweets. And I think there's a lot of disadvantages to the texting and emailing, but one advantage is people do it immediately.
Right. That's right. So
That
sometimes,
is going to be the
yeah,
best account
right.
when you talk to someone who was at Dealey Plaza,
Mhm.
not 20 years later.
Right. That's right. Right.
Yeah,
Right.
and you have a great-great-grandfather that I've read was at
Mm.
Ford's Theater.
That's right. That's right.
Lincoln's
That's right.
assassination.
Yeah.
James.
Emery. Yeah. My oldest daughter is named Emery.
I'm not sure if you've read, there's a great book, We Saw Lincoln Shot. And it's varying accounts. I want to say like 75 different accounts of people
Wow.
who were there that night.
Wow.
They are incredible. Some of them range from a man jumped down from the balcony. There was a bomb that went off. Other accounts talk about, Lincoln and Booth had swords on another. But it is just wild how much different accounts.
Right.
Change. So
That's right.
very interesting to see with the age we're in today, how it's documented.
You're right. And another thing that's interesting too is sometimes in the past, you only get the letters and diaries of sort of people in positions of power, right? People who are famous at the time. And it's hard to find kind of the average everyday person. And it's really, really valuable when you can. And I don't know if you've read Eric Larson's The Splendid and the Vile, which is a great example of that, about the Blitz. But he was able to access all these everyday people. It's Churchill's accounts, but it's also, this woman who, is right there in her apartment, and her fear and everything. And it's very palpable and very real. And it gives you a much more honest sense of what it felt like to live at that time. So there might be some value in that, because we do live in a time when everybody can be a journalist, right? You just start your own blog or you start your own podcast or whatever, and you can start transmitting from wherever you are.
Absolutely. Candice, this has been an absolute treat.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
I reiterate to our viewers, do yourself a favor. The River of Doubt, it's a page turner. It's out there right now. And also, do yourself another favor, and you could read about one of our forgotten presidents, James Garfield, in Destiny of the Republic, and you will be enthralled. It is some of the best historical, biographical work of our time, and I sincerely believe that.
Thank you. No, I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Nick.
That'll do it for us at Hindsight History. We'll see you next time.